Hello, everybody. My name is Alan Abbey. I'm the media director of the Shalom Hartman Institute. We're here in Jerusalem with Alan Smason of the Crescent City Jewish News and Mike Wagenheim of I-24, a cable station that broadcasts in 3 languages. We'll hear more about that in a minute. This is a special Hartman Institute American Jewish Press Association webinar. We're going to talk tonight about the recently concluded 4-day conference that the Israeli government put on for well over 150 bloggers and journalists from something like 30 countries around the world.
Correct.
And we're going to talk a little about what they did and what their message was, why they did this. And we have several of the participants in the conference and other journalists here live in our studios and at the Hartman campus to bring some more questions to you. So I want to start with you, Alan, because you and I I was at many of the events. You were at almost everything. And just give us a little summary about some highlights of this conference, what the goal was, and who some of the most interesting speakers, what were some of the interesting ideas that came out of this conference?
Well, first off, this is the 3rd iteration of the Jewish Media Summit. The very first one was 2014. That was followed 2 years later in 2016. And then, of course, this year, we didn't find out that they were going to hold this one until a little bit late in the year. And this one was held, obviously, the last 4 days. But this is the 3rd one. This is a little bit different than the other. The other 2 were more reaching out to traditional media. This one was intending to reach out to more of the new media, the bloggers, the social media people, the influencers, as it were. And the intent was to try to reach out to them as opposed to just the standard normal, if you will, journalists and editors that they've dealt with in the past. Some of the people that talked to us, of course, the usual cast of characters from the government press office, Nitzan Khan, and of course was there, and we were very surprised because we were hoping to be able to get some of the top ministers, and at one point there didn't seem to be too many ministers, and then all of a sudden today at the Knesset when we went, who shows up but Benjamin Netanyahu? And he fielded questions.
Well, that's quite a surprise. Netanyahu, the prime minister, had been on the agenda for the first day.
But video.
Only on video.
Yes.
And then there was a tremendous amount of, well, maybe he'll show up, maybe he'll come. And if I recall, 2 years ago, the prime minister did not show up. So the question is, how seriously did Netanyahu take this program?
Actually, he did show up 2 years ago, but the questions were already fielded, and there was only one person who got to ask a question, and the question that particular person asked was not particularly pertinent to what the discussion was.
So what did the prime minister say today?
Well, he pretty much talked about the disconnect with the diaspora a little bit that we were talking about. He talked about also anti-Semitism, the rise of it throughout Europe and other parts of the world, and how Israel is essentially trying to become or maintain its position as far as the watchdog for that, and several other aspects of what Israel is doing to try to improve relationships with the outside diaspora. But that's pretty much where he was headed and talking to us about, because it's basically a very difficult task to get him to answer questions. And when he's there, of course, his time is very limited. Today, luckily, if you will, there was a vote in the Knesset, and he was there to try to influence them. So I think that he was sort of doing 2 things at one time.
So, Mike Wagenheim, you're a political correspondent and analyst for I-24. I'll ask you in a few minutes to tell us more about I-24, but from your perspective, what was the purpose of this conference? Why did the government press office go to the expense of bringing over 140 people to Israel? Now, by the way, what the government did was it paid everybody's expenses on the ground, which was hotel costs and meals and moving them around, and a few schmitchiks here. There was some entertainment from this group called Voca People. And at the same time, however, the journalists did have to, at least the ones that I know of, pretty much paid their own way to fly here. But nonetheless, a significant expense by the government press office. What is the purpose of this? What is the reason for this?
Well, we saw just within the last 48 hours, CNN releasing a survey about anti-Semitism in the world, and those numbers were absolutely startling and disturbing. So you take just that one survey, and you realize that Israel needs all the help it can get all around the world. And when it already has people who have an affinity for Judaism, who live it, who have a passion for it, who write about it, who blog about it, what better friends, what better people you can have to try to say good things about Israel as well. So it's an opportunity to bring folks like Alan over here to show the brighter sides of Israel that you don't always get to see from back home in America, from back in Europe. Some of the technological breakthroughs that are going on here, some of the innovation, some of the even cooperation and coexistence that you're seeing with Palestinians that doesn't really get a lot of news as well either. So it's an opportunity to really bring those things to the forefront and to show folks in the diaspora who already have an affinity that, hey, there are some other great things you don't even know about that we'd like you to talk about a little bit more.
Well, speaking of anti-Semitism, at one of the sessions I was at, the director of a website in Switzerland, not a country you'd think would be struggling with anti-Semitism, gave a very strong and impassioned speech about just how bad anti-Semitism is in Switzerland. And clearly, this is just the day before the CNN report, so she was not exaggerating. So at the same time, at the same conference, the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Oren of the Kulanu Party, spoke at the opening session. And he talked about, he tried very gently to talk about address the Netanyahu administration's footsie with leaders, authoritarian leaders in Eastern Europe, maybe even President Trump of the United States. But let's stick for the moment, at least, to Europe, such as Viktor Orban in Hungary.
Correct.
And who are, they love Israel, but they don't seem to like Jews so much. So where does if the Netanyahu administration, as Alan says, is speaking to seek to develop and improve, be defender of Jews around the world, why do they downplay and whitewash even anti-Semitism in countries such as Lithuania? And even when the shooting happened in Pittsburgh, the Minister of Education and Diaspora Affairs, Naftali Bennett, also made a point of saying, well, America's not that bad. How do you fit those two pieces together?
There's some cognitive dissonance going on there for sure. The Prime Minister is in a tight spot, especially when it comes to Europe. The European Union generally votes as a bloc and, generally speaking, has been hostile to Israel in international forums, has not been on Israel's side, rarely takes up for it. So the Prime Minister's strategy was to divide and conquer, to find places where he could pick certain countries off, because everybody has one vote at the United Nations. It doesn't matter if you're America or Luxembourg. Everybody's got one vote. So if you can start to divide and conquer and get friends here and there, then you can start to turn the tide. Now, where do those friends come from? It's not coming from France. It's generally not coming from Germany. He had to find another course. Unfortunately, that course has consequences. And you look at, the Viktor Orbáns of the world. You're also looking at not so much Sebastian Kurz from Austria, but his partners within the far-right Freedom Party with a history of neo-Nazism, anti-Semitism. Israel, at least for the moment, is boycotting that party, but doing business with that government. It's a fine line to walk, but the Prime Minister felt like he had no choice but to find friends where he could to start turning the tide in international forums.
So, Alan, speaking of finding friends where he could, you're a journalist. You believe in telling the true story, the real story, sometimes a difficult story. Despite the show of support, and I know you're a Zionist and a supporter of Israel, but as a journalist, you also want to tell both sides or the many sides of a story. So when the Prime Minister openly, in a way, asks you to be his PR guy because Israel gets bad coverage from other media, as even that was part of the session, what do you do as a journalist? How do you respond to that?
He can ask. The point is that we are on their dime, as it were, or shekel. The fact is that we have paid our way here, and we get to hear what they want to say. What we have to do is ask the questions. Today, we were able to actually ask some questions of the Prime Minister that had never been able to be asked previously, and I was very thankful for that. But again, there are a lot of tough questions that don't get asked. And so in those particular cases, what we have to do is just sort of do what we can to be vigilant, to pursue the truth, and do what we can to try to discern whether or not we're being fed a line or not. I can tell you quite honestly, as a journalist, I was quite appalled when I asked a specific question back in 2014 about where the three boys who had been abducted, where they might have been abducted, and that there were reports that we had heard through the grapevine, unconfirmed, that they had been killed and that were actually taped, and that they had actually heard that. We asked the government spokesman about that pointedly. Have you heard any? Don't know what you're talking about. So again, in the United States, we're used to getting answers to tough questions. Here, the answers may not be as forthcoming.
Well, it was one of my journalistic heroes, I.F. Stone, who said all governments are run by liars. So maybe he was lying for a good cause, perhaps.
Well, and that's what they would probably say, that for security purposes they didn't want to say anything. But again, those are the sorts of things that can be done in deep background. And not bruise the feelings between the journalists and the government people that are actually the spokespeople.
So, Mike, one of the themes, one of the hottest sessions of the conference was on the question of when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? And there was, for those of you in the know, I'll take a few seconds to set this up. There was Ephraim Zuroff, who's the last Nazi hunter from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who focuses on Europe and is quite aware of the rising anti-Semitism. And there was another person from the Israel Project who spoke actually quite moderately. But for the journalists in the audience, one of the more fun aspects of this was seeing Caroline Glick of the Jerusalem Post sit next to Anshel Pfeffer of Haaretz. And if you couldn't really pick two mainstream journalists with more divergent views. I know Caroline, and then Anshel, I worked with Caroline at the Jerusalem Post, and so this was a hot moment where at one point Caroline jumped up out of her seat, called her a liar, and poor Chaviv Gur of the Times of Israel, which is in fact something of a middle-of-the-road media entity anyway, somewhere between the Post and Haaretz, as it were, on the political spectrum, was struggling and doing his darn best to keep them from being at each other's throats. But this doesn't answer the question of when and whether anti-Zionist critique of Israel becomes anti-Semitism. Where is that line? Is there a line?
Well, the problem becomes is that different people within even the Jewish community have different versions of what Zionism is. And it's changed over time, and it's tough to define sometimes. Is Zionism simply to have a homeland for the Jewish people, or is it to expand that homeland to whatever point it is? And there are points on that line that still aren't really defined. I think where anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism, and I think they are to a large extent one and the same, is saying Jews have no right to a homeland. That is anti-Zionism, period, nekuda. And that's automatically anti-Semitism. That's where I think the line gets drawn. But Jews within our own community, both in Israel and in the diaspora, have not quite figured out over the last 50 years now, 70 years, what has Zionism become and where is Zionism going?
And let me add one other thing
please.
too. Dr. Hillel Newman, who's the director of the World Jewish Affairs Department, he spoke today and he's emphatically stated that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Just emphatically, flat out said it. And it is part of what Benjamin Netanyahu said, as well as this morning we spoke at the president's residence with President Reuven Rivlin. He also talked about the changing world of, if you will, the population of Israel and the fact that there are 4 tribes.
Yes.
He called the diaspora the 5th, of course.
Yes.
So, but it was a very interesting counterpoint that I'd never heard before, and this seems to be the direction that the government is moving into, to give equal footing to the Jewish population, the secular population, and then of course the other segments, the Arab population, and then the other Haredi population.
Yes, I've heard President Rivlin talk about that, and the question that's interesting to hear you tell us that he views diaspora Jewry as the 5th tribe. I think diaspora Jewry is maybe more diverse than a single tribe. But I want to ask you this, Alan, though, again, as a journalist and as a supporter of Israel and a friend to the Jewish state and as a Zionist, you're embedded in the Jewish community as a Jewish journalist. You live and breathe journalism, and you live and breathe the Jewish community. How far can you go in being critical of Israel on a specific issue, or do you feel hemmed in by your audience, by the sponsors, by the people who you maybe answer to, if you answer to anybody? And isn't that a difficult place to be?
I think it's sort of like having a family and having a son who does something that might not be acceptable from time to time, and that we still love him, but we still sometimes have to have him disciplined, or he has to stand in the light of day and answer the questions that have to be asked.
But do you feel how far can you go? I mean, do you know in your heart, as it were, how far you can go? Is there a line that you don't cross?
Well, I would like to think that we can be critical without being so critical as to make them look like villains, and I think that's the big problem. I don't think that Israel has done anything, though, to be considered villainous about. So I think they've done what they've done to survive. They've done what they've done through the years, of course, to establish a rapport with the various peoples in whose territory they reside. I think it's difficult, though, to be able to do a lot of things overnight, because it's really not, as the Prime Minister said today, it's really not their fault. It's from outside. It's the people who are not accepting them and their ability to be here and take part in living in this land as everybody who is here wants to do.
Now, Mike, I told you I'd give you a chance to talk about I-24, and for those of you who don't know, it's a very interesting, perhaps even very exciting operation based in the, excuse me, in the Tel Aviv Jaffa port, and with a very large and beautiful newsroom. I've been in it myself, and this is an opportunity to speak about Jewish media. First of all, do you consider I-24 to be Jewish media? Do you consider it to be on the side of the government, the way perhaps news outlets like Al Jazeera are close, if not directly tied to the government of Qatar, and other Middle East media that always have a point of view, always have a perspective, even if they do good, straight journalistic reporting? So tell us a bit about I-24 and how you see it fits in either in the Jewish media world or in the growing world of Middle East media.
So it's important to define what I-24 is to begin with. Number one, unlike Russia Today, unlike Al Jazeera, unlike France 24, we're not owned by the government. We're owned by a corporation called the Altice Group, which is the head of that group is Patrick Draghi. He's a Moroccan Israeli who lives in France. He's the owner of a large cable system here in Israel. We do not answer to the government, period, which we're the only international television station broadcasting through the world that is not government-owned and government-controlled. As far as Jewish media goes, I don't define us as Jewish media. I define us as Israeli media, as Middle East media. We have 330 journalists from all around the world, all different religions. I sat on a panel one day. You had an American-born Jew, a Danish-Brazilian Christian, and an Israeli Arab together on one panel in the same room together. That's what we bring to the table, is a million different perspectives. So I define us as Israeli media, Israeli-focused, but certainly not Jewish media. And I think that gives us a very unique perspective on the world, and I think that allows us to deliver the news in a well-rounded way where people can say, I might not agree with it, but at least I got all the sides.
So I can watch, or people in North America can watch I-24 now on cable, isn't that right?
We expanded into America last February, and we're constantly growing. On the Suddenlink system, we were just moved into the slot between CNN and Fox News, and within a few weeks, our ratings tripled. We're on the optimal cable system as well, and growing and growing. We're in about, I think, 6 million homes now, and it projected at the beginning next year to expand that to 30 million homes.
Well, I'm glad you're getting more viewers from being between CNN and Fox. I don't think I would want to be between CNN and Fox. So but if you don't define yourself as a Jewish medium, but an Israeli television network, do you see yourself, though, as presenting the Israeli point of view when it comes to the stories that Al Jazeera or RT or France 24 might report the same stories? They all have correspondents here in Israel. Xinhua, the Chinese agency, pumps out 15, 20 stories a day from Israel, but often with a Chinese angle to them. So what's your angle?
Our angle is to tell the truth. Our angle is to, bad, good, or anything in between, to tell the truth. And if it comes out pro-Israel, that's wonderful. I love Israel, and I think 95% of the people I work with are Zionists who love Israel. Sometimes it doesn't come out so good. Sometimes the news just isn't something that you're proud of. It's not something that you want to call home and tell your parents about, that this is what's going on here. But it's our duty to report it. And I've fallen in love with this place. But it doesn't mean every day I'm going to go on and whatever Bibi says that day or whatever the government tells me to say, oh yeah, sure. No, it doesn't. It just doesn't Doesn't work that way. So we definitely we're experts on Israel, but it doesn't mean that everything we put out there is what Israelis want us to put out there.
So now I-24 is a well-funded operation with gorgeous studios on the shores of the Mediterranean. And as Mike just said, a large staff and well-funded by a billionaire cable industry operator who's able to put his network on the cables, many of the cable networks he owns. So that is a very prosperous and hopefully very successful organization. But that doesn't speak to most of the Jewish media in the world, Alan, which are small, many of which are struggling. I've done some research into this, and I hear constantly from both North American and European Jewish media that they are having a hard time. And that was, in fact, a topic that did not get discussed at the conference that I had hoped would be one of the focuses of the conference, but it was pretty much all about Israel. But Alan, in the sidelines and from what you know of people you know and people you spoke to, what were people saying to you about how they're doing?
Well, it's not at all good. By the same token, as Gary Rosenblatt said, we're holding on. He said that's as good as you can do nowadays. So I think that's pretty much, if you're able to have status quo and you're pulling in advertising revenue to sustain yourself, that's about as much as you can ask for. And these days, there's so many institutions that we know and love that have either morphed into other kinds of publications. Hadassah Magazine, for instance, used to publish 10 times a year. And now I believe they come out, 6 times or 5 times? 6, I think. So the point is that that's an enormous amount of their content that has disappeared. And you'll find that a lot of people are just doing what they can to hold on, and a lot of people just cannot make a living doing what they did just 10, 15 years ago, and that's a shame. Now, you know who would answer a little bit to that is Mike. His journey to Israel is a fascinating one. And I think you might want to ask a little bit of his background, because he was actually in Louisiana. I'm, of course, in New Orleans, not far away in Thibodaux at Nicholls State, and also at the University of New Orleans in sports. And his journey to Israel, becoming a political correspondent, is fascinating.
Well, okay, I guess I'll ask you about that.
I'll try to make it quick. One of the disadvantages, but also one of the advantages I have of covering things here, is that I was a blank slate. About 3.5 years ago now. I had never been to Israel before I made Aliyah. I didn't know anybody here. I didn't have a job lined up, nothing. And I hadn't been to shul since my bar mitzvah. And that was about 25 years before I made Aliyah. So I won't go into the reasons why, but I just decided to pack my suitcases and go. I didn't know Bibi from Ben Gurion when I landed. And it has been a history lesson and a crash course in Israeli society and Israeli politics every day. So I come from a point of view where I didn't have any prejudices. I didn't have any bias. Everything I see, I'm likely seeing for the first time. And that's the perspective that I bring. And I think it has its disadvantages, but it also has its advantages in that I'm not colored in my views. So that's been a heck of a journey. It's been amazing learning the political system here. One thing that I've learned very quickly, and I can tell, obviously I go on the news and have to predict and prognosticate, and I'm correct much more often than I'm not. And I can tell my wife 3 weeks in advance what the result's going to be of the next scandal. And I can do that because I learned one thing very quickly. Whatever's happening in Israeli politics, everybody is chasing their own motives. Everybody has their own motives, and everybody's looking out for their own interests. And if you just follow that logic, you know what's coming up around the bend. So it's been an amazing ride so far, and again, it's been an eye-opening experience.
Well, that is quite a story. I have not a similar kind of a story, but again, that's for another time, maybe over a beer together. We have some members of the Jewish media who were at the conference. We're going to invite them up to the standing mic here to offer some thoughts in a minute, but I just wanted to ask you again, Alan, about there was a different population, as you said, at this session than there was. The previous sessions included primarily traditional media, newspapers and magazines. Yesterday at lunch, I sat with 5 women who are food bloggers who all live and work in the New York area. One has actually moved to Israel, but they're very New York. And one is a dietitian, and one has a cookbook, and one does parties, and one does, I don't know, one does lifestyle, and they all work together. And they were there part of this conference, and a key part, because there were 5 of them, and they were there telling their stories during lunch. One of the women was broadcasting into her phone while we were eating somewhat gluey lunch. So what is this kind of audience, this kind of new media, how do they fit with the Jewish media that you're familiar with, the traditional newspapers, and are they the future? Is that why the Netanyahu administration brought them here?
I think part of the puzzle, as it were, as to why they were there is specifically that. I think that the future of journalism seems to be that paradigm shift to the social media, the influencers, rather than the traditional editors and publishers that we've known through the years. And that a lot of the emphasis in terms of the anti-Israel movements that may be out there, BDS, what have you, that they're emanating and they're utilizing the social media. So that there is a lot of pushback now for people as to how to combat it. And the best way to do it is to have a good line of defense, I think, within the social media to protect their interests. It's just, I think, the way that they see that the future is going to be, and that the people out there who are right now blogging will become the people that other people will depend upon because of their unique status now as members of the blogosphere, or as members of influencers, as it were.
Well, while we wait for somebody to come to the mic, I just wanted to pose one more question to you, Mike, and that is, okay, so one of the, speaking of your calling yourself a blank slate, one of the people I met yesterday, not one of these food bloggers, was a woman who ran a blog in Connecticut. And maybe she's been to Israel once, but she's pretty much a blank slate from her own admission. And recently, she was either acquired or hired by a mysterious organization. She wouldn't tell me the name, a Jewish organization. And she now runs a blog called StopAntisemitism.org. I hope I got that right. And this is not somebody with traditional journalistic training. You had it in sports media. Alan's had it in his newspaper for a long time, who may not have either the training or the expertise or the classic values of journalism, which is, I'm not even talking about objectivity, but digging into facts, telling a story, and not essentially being a propaganda arm. So how does that play into the Netanyahu approach?
Oh, boy, that's a really good question. Benjamin Netanyahu, give him kudos for a lot of things that he does. He understands the power of media. It's one of the reasons why he's in a little bit of trouble right now with the corruption allegations surrounding him, is because he realizes that newspapers still have value, and try to get more favorable coverage in those particular papers. Even websites, not blogs, but websites still have value. He realizes that. So it's been really his push to make sure he's been getting favorable coverage in traditional outlets. And he's hired at the same time a lot of these, I feel so old for saying this, a lot of these hip social media young guys that are just out of the IDF, who got their training through the IDF in social media, in new media, and they're part of the Prime Minister's office. They're on the payroll there. Even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm doing a story now on their digital diplomacy program. These aren't, it's not just hand-to-hand meetings anymore between diplomats. There is a full staff in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which the Prime Minister runs, that runs social media throughout the world, 800 accounts in 7 different languages, trying to push out the message. So he has all of his bases covered. You can follow that model in Jewish media. And it's not just good enough to have social media. It's not just good enough to have blogs. You have to have all your bases covered now if you want to be a successful endeavor, and you've got to find the people that can cover all your bases.
Well, speaking of covering all the bases, I'm going to put one of our audience members on the spot. Ita Price Gibson has been a veteran Israeli journalist. She's written for probably every news organization out here, both in Hebrew and in English. And I know you didn't get to the conference, but you're certainly familiar with the environment here in the Israeli media system. And can you comment on what Mike said about the Netanyahu administration and social media and its role versus the traditional media, which sometimes hold their feet to the fire, perhaps more than these food bloggers will?
Sure. I mean, I think that maybe I'm just dating myself and giving myself away. I think there's a role for everything. And we know that there's data that also kind of shows that people, as they get older, start moving away from blogging towards the more traditional or the longer form media. I think there's still a market for people who write serious, well thought out, and I look at whether it be on the web or on the, I don't know, not social media, but let's say through the web, as more an issue of delivery. But traditional, well-edited, fact-checked information is still going to be important. We're seeing that it's becoming more important because it's the balance, I think, to so much of this blogging, which is simply incorrect or not careful about what it's saying. And as somebody who's both been an editor, I was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report, but also a writer, I'm thankful to editors because I assume that it's my job to present the truth or the facts as well as I can, and that I might make a mistake. And I'm really glad that there's someone else behind me checking on it. The problem we have is that that's very expensive. That means that I'm very reassured that anything I write is read by somebody who's knowledgeable, who questions it, who catches errors. I remember an error that I wrote that there were 800,000 Jews in Hungary because extra zeros that I typed. And I didn't see them because I typed them. And it's so reassuring to know, and I think readers should know, or consumers should know, that there's somebody else checking it, as opposed to a blog.
But do you think, Ita, that the bloggers who are one or two person operations, who may be funded by somebody who we don't really know, will bring the same journalistic ethics? And those of you from the AJPA who are watching this know that this is a particular interest, or shall we say obsession of mine, that journalists should be ethical. And that ethics and ethical values, in fact, are our greatest currency and give us the most strength. That's at least what we think. The question is whether the average reader who gets content off of a feed on Facebook, one feed is from Moment Magazine, where I know you've written, or the Jerusalem Report, or Haaretz, or I-24, and the next is from a food blogger who maybe has been paid by Manischewitz to write a piece about their matzah or their wine, and they don't tell anybody about that because that's not even in their DNA to consider it.
No, it's not. Moreover, it's almost a perfect storm because it's the news you can choose. You choose what you want to read, and then it's marketed to you because that's what you want to read. And I think in the same way as if you once check a destination that you were thinking of going on, within 5 minutes, Facebook is telling me that I might be going to the Faroe Islands, which I don't even really consider an option, but I did look them up a few minutes before I came. I'm now bombarded with the Faroe Islands. There's a very clever big brother doing this at the same time as we're choosing. And we're not always knowing what we're choosing. We don't always know who's paying for the news. We don't always know what their agendas are. If I may, though, I don't know if I can, I want to go back to something you said, because you discussed anti-Semitism. When does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? And I'm concerned of the wording of that.
Okay.
Because we talk, as an Israeli journalist, and although I was born in America, I've been here long enough that I see myself as an Israeli. And since I write in both languages, Hebrew and English, we talk about criticism of the government, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. There's a third thing here. And I think that the government is very deliberately trying to confuse them. Certainly the anti-Zionism critique of the government trying to confuse, using it as a canard that comes up all the time. Everything's anti-Semitic. And that is a great way to rally the troops, especially when, as we all say, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. There generally is anti-Semitism, and it's growing, and we're concerned about it. Criticism of the government is not the same thing. And of course, as an Israeli journalist, I see it my responsibility to critique the government. That's one of the things I do. That, as far as I'm concerned, when I teach journalism, and I know I didn't make this up, but I don't know where it came from. So with all due respect to whomever I'm plagiarizing. You know, we say if your mother says she loves you, we want it confirmed by 2 independent sources. And now you got to tell the kids that Wikipedia isn't a source. But having said that, yeah, one of our ethics is to take a position of doubt, respectful doubt, willingness to give up that doubt if proven otherwise. But my position is I doubt anything anybody tells me unless I'm told otherwise, because that's my responsibility.
So I want to get back to your point, but let me just say that I do know where that quote came from. It's
Oh,
from
thank
the
you.
famous, now gone City News Bureau of Chicago. And the more direct quote is a little bit more Chicago urban abrupt than yours, which was, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. And that is something, yes, I've used that in the journalism classes that I've taught as well. But I want to bring this back to you two guys about is criticizing the Israeli government. Can that be done without it being perceived as anti-Zionist? And I think Ita is 100% correct when she says that in Israel, the level of criticism of the government by the media is far higher than is anything tolerated in North America within the Jewish community of North America. And Alan and Mike, I'd like you to address that. Do you feel comfortable critiquing the Israeli government, or do you fear that people will call you out on
Okay,
that?
well, there's two different things here now at play, because first of all, in the United States, freedom of the press is guaranteed according to the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. Here in Israel, there is no Constitution. So they're playing with a whole different set of cards as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
So it makes it much more difficult to be able to be critical of the government, because you're not guaranteed of that right to criticize automatically. I think they tolerate the press, but I don't think that they necessarily have to give in to the press if the press hounds them about a certain, and I think, Mike, that might be something you could expound on, because you're doing this, you're on the ground floor doing this daily.
I've never felt any kind of pressure from the government. The only thing that they've really come down on is when they feel national security is at stake. And there was just an incident a few days ago where Hamas published allegedly some photos of special ops forces that had incurred on the Gaza Strip in a botched operation a few months ago, I guess 6 weeks ago, which led to the rockets coming into Israel. And Hamas published ostensibly photos of that special ops force, and the Israeli government said, you cannot publish these photos. They told the public, you cannot publish these photos anywhere because it risks revealing way too much. So that they come down hard on, and they will come after you on matters of national security. Other than that, I've never felt the pressure here.
I don't think the Pentagon Papers would have been published in Israel.
No, they wouldn't have. Absolutely
so
not.
keep that in mind.
Well, first of all, it is true, in fact, that the Israeli government asked the media and not to publish the pictures, only blurred out faces, and also made an unusual request. This is the government censor, and Israel does have a government censor, not to even talk about any details they may have picked up around the water cooler about what had happened, because presumably Hamas is paying attention to what Israeli media and social media are saying, and they don't want to give any added information in a way that could benefit them. At the same time, it took me all of 30 seconds to find those photographs online. And so I wonder whether that notion of censorship is antiquated, and whether, and as an Israeli citizen with 2 sons in the army, I understand the need for security, and one in the intelligence units, and he doesn't tell me anything about what he's doing. So I understand that. But at the same time, it's a big world out there. And so how do they get away with doing that?
It's important to note the distinction. It's not a government censor, it's an IDF censor. So there's a bit of nuance in there. How do they get away with it? You know, the less exposure it gets, every single time one person posts it, how many shares, how many reshares does it get, how many comments does it get? That's what Hamas is counting on. So the Israeli government and the IDF aren't stupid. They know the images are going to get out there. What they want to try to do is limit the damage, because when one person sees, oh, that's my neighbor, now you've got a problem. And so that's what they're trying to limit.
There is a lot of self-censorship in the Israeli media, and for all of the criticism that the Israeli media are raging leftists who only want to bring down the government, when it comes to matters like this, pretty much everybody falls in line. So that kind of destroys, or at least chips away at the government claim that all his media are against him. We have another good friend of ours here ask a question. Please stand a little closer to the mic. Tell us your name.
Ed Weintraub from the Jewish Star, newspaper in the Five Towns in New York. The image of Israel around the world is certainly, it's a challenge to keep the image looking good. And part of the problem, I think, has to do with how tight the government or the IDF tries to hold its information. And my example that I've given to many people over the years is from the last Gaza war. My editor flew to Israel with a number of editors from American newspapers, and she comes back and she has great stories. And I said, "Where are the pictures?" And she said, "The IDF wouldn't let me take any pictures." And I said, jokingly in part, "No pictures, no story." And today, if you don't have pictures, you're going nowhere on the internet. Right. So the IDF just put too many restrictions on. I sat at my desk looking at pictures coming in from Gaza during that war, and hundreds of pictures coming in from Reuters and the Associated Press of casualties in Gaza. And from Israel, nothing. And then people come to me, "Oh, look at the New York Times, they're biased. All they run are pictures from Gaza." Well, they weren't getting pictures from Israel. Now, the damage in Gaza was more severe, and there would be more pictures from Gaza. But Israel needed to be more proactive in getting the message out and letting people see what happened.
So, Ed, while we have you here, I wanted to, you and I chatted a little bit during the conference, and we were discussing the economic vitality and we have another media person here I want to bring on in a few minutes too, but we were talking about media vitality. The Five Towns of Long Island, for those who don't know, is a very Jewish community, growing, and there are actually 3 newspapers in this area covering ostensibly the same news and focusing on one segment, perhaps the largest, you tell me, of Jewish community in that area. Tell us a little bit about that, because it is, first of all, it's unique, I suspect.
It's unique. Yeah.
And it's healthy. I tend to think and hope competition is healthy, but tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I've been in the newspaper business for 40 years. I published a secular paper, the Brooklyn paper, for 30 years in Brooklyn. So the newspaper business is in my blood. But I don't see a long-term strategy for saving newspapers in general. And that goes for Jewish newspapers in general. The exception that I think will hold on a little bit longer are the Orthodox newspapers. In the Five Towns, there are 3 papers. Mine happens to be the smallest at this point. The other papers run between 100 and 144 pages every single week.
Alan just fell out of his chair. He wishes he could do
and
that.
This is probably around 60% advertising.
Yeah.
In Brooklyn, there's a paper that does the same, and in Queens and in part of New Jersey, there are also free distribution Jewish newspapers, widely read in their communities, packed with advertising. And the reason is that in the Orthodox community, you've got Shabbos, you have Yontif, and those papers go into the houses, and they are read. And but that's an exception. You know, that's an exception to the rules. So we're doing well in the Five Towns, and I wish the rest of Jewish media could find a solution too.
So as a paper for the Orthodox, though, and I've had some dealings with some of your competitors or frenemies, whatever, in your region, they're not really open to the entire Jewish community, are they?
We get this comment. There are issues, all right, obviously. In the Orthodox community, we have certain community standards about what you're able to publish. And in the Orthodox community, while we certainly respect people who have different paths to Judaism, there are issues about calling a synagogue, a conservative synagogue, a Reformed temple, a temple. I mean, this is not an issue, I think, in the rest of America maybe, but it's an issue in communities like New York and Baltimore where you have large Orthodox populations. My job as an editor in this community is to be truthful, is to be honest. We don't go out of our way to cover the conservative movement or the reform movement because my readers are not interested in reading about it. And I think that's a basic rule for any newspaper. You're going to cover what your readers are interested in. We gave a lot of coverage to Pittsburgh. We called it a synagogue. We referred to the spiritual leader as a rabbi in that case. But it's a challenge. And I think all of Am Yisrael has a challenge in working together and being together. You know, our numbers are low enough, and we need to find a way to be one.
Alan, your paper is a true community paper. Do you reach are you able to bring Orthodox and non-Orthodox viewpoints and readers together?
Absolutely. We don't discriminate according to whoever is actually accessing our website. And that we are really a website. We publish annuals, but the website is updated 24/7, except on Jewish holidays and of course Shabbat. But
So 24/6.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I like to say 24/7 because sometimes there are days where you can, and so. But the point is that we do not have a perspective which is Orthodox or is Reform or is conservative. It's intended to be a portal for all Jews to be able to get the news that they want to get, whether it's national, international, Israeli news, or possibly something on a regional level. Speaking of regional, Larry Brook is in the audience. Larry has Southern Jewish Life magazine, which he actually does penetrate the New Orleans market as well as much of the southern region.
So tell us about this, because you have to reach not just one community that may have a clear identity. The New Orleans Jewish community has a history and a culture. You're in several states and you deal with a very diverse community. How do you manage that?
Yeah, we do have a very diverse community. We're based in Birmingham, also part-time New Orleans, but those are our two biggest markets, but we hit all the rest of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida Panhandle, a little bit of neighboring states as well. So it's just a matter of getting a handle on what's going on. Of course, in our region, the numbers are very small. There are apartment buildings in New York that have more Jews than the whole state of Mississippi. But also in our region, everyone's related to each other. Everyone went to summer camp with each other. It's even though we're region wide and have a very large geographic area, it's still putting all these small communities into part of a larger community.
So you have a Southern Jewish culture that has some identifiable characteristics that gives you some commonality, even if people are in different states?
Oh, definitely, yeah. Yeah, the Southern Jewish experience is definitely unique. There's a museum that's going to be opening in 2020 in New Orleans about
Right.
that. It had closed in Mississippi in 2012 when Jacobs Camp needed that building on its campus. And also, Utica, Mississippi is not exactly on the beaten path for a museum. So they closed and they're going to reopen in New Orleans. But a couple of things that were brought up before, the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and in terms of criticizing the government, I figure criticizing a government can't really be classified as anti-Zionism unless you say that the government shouldn't exist. And I'm not talking about this coalition or that coalition. I'm talking about the government as in the state should not exist. That would definitely be anti-Semitism. And also it's a matter of consistency, because there's a Palestinian film festival hosted at a theater in our region every so often. And I interviewed the head of that theater, and he's like, no, I don't believe there should be a Jewish state. So is that anti-Semitism? Well, one would jump to say, well, of course that's anti-Semitism. What do you mean there can't be a Jewish state? But he continued, I don't believe there should be a Syrian state. I don't believe there should be a France, a Germany. He was just against nationalism completely. So the fact that he doesn't think there should be a Jewish state, he's consistent. He's not singling out the Jewish state.
So he's following the John Lennon Imagine.
Exactly, yeah.
Well,
Well, I think that is actually one of the issues that has come up in current discourse with the President of the United States calling himself a nationalist and not a globalist. And whether you want to read globalist as code for Jew, I don't know. But there is a very strong nationalist movement throughout Europe, Eastern Europe, as we mentioned earlier, and in the United States, and frankly here in Israel as well.
True.
And at the same time, there is a large community of people who feel that nationalism has taken on only negative characteristics. And the Jews, as usual, are both on both sides of that issue and caught in the middle of that issue.
is nationalism fascism? That's a good question.
That's a good question. I don't know. As usual with the Jewish conversation, we'll end up with more questions than answers.
Of course.
But in terms of some of the news you're covering, again, I come back to the Netanyahu embrace of people with problematic ideas, putting themselves, in fact, essentially putting Israel in the camp of the nationalists around the world and making us perhaps more easily grabbed at as examples of a, shall we call it a, I won't call it a apartheid state, but a nationalist and ultra nationalist state, along with people like Erdogan in Turkey, and not that he's a great friend of Israel, but Orban and Lithuania. And so this makes it more difficult for Israel.
You know, in one way it does, but let's be honest here. People oftentimes don't need a reason to hate Israel. And the anti-Semitism that comes from the right and some of the friendships that Benjamin Netanyahu and the alliances that he has developed with governments with very problematic histories and sometimes problematic present feelings about the Jews, there's plenty of that on the left in Europe as well. And if he were to go make friends with those governments, he'd encounter a lot of the same problems with the anti-Semitism on the left in a lot of European countries. There's very few countries anymore, and there's very few governments that can play it down the, even Angela Merkel, who says the reason for Germany's existence is to protect Israel. She's calling up the Romanian president saying, don't move your embassy to Jerusalem. That was a report in the Jerusalem Post a few days ago. So it comes from all places. There's something to be said, certainly, for critiquing the prime minister, for forging these alliances with these governments that have very, very problematic constituencies. But again, if he goes the other way, you can make the same point.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. I'll maybe give everybody one more chance. I'd like to ask Alan just to give us your sense of, was this conference worth it for you, or was it all a PR you could have simply gotten press releases or photographs, handouts for? Do you get something tachlis, something tactile out of
Well,
this?
first off, you and I both got to go to the Temple Mount for the first time.
That is correct.
So you know, right then and there, I was able to go back to ancient times, if you will, trod the same steps that the ancient priests actually performed their services and their rites, etc. So I got a connection more to my relationship with my religion than I think I ever did in either of the previous iterations of the summit. I also thought that they did a very good job of scheduling, or maybe I should say over-scheduling us, because the members of the AJPA who weren't able to come, who are maybe listening in right now, would be pleased to know that while they were able to do their jobs, it was very difficult for us to file reports, to be able to update our websites and things of that sort. We got no spare time, and of course the answer from the government is, well, you're on our dime. You know, you can take your breaks when you want to, when we're not paying for it. So I understood that. But you know, they did really do a little bit of a very good PR job in terms of talking about the arts, in terms of talking about, you know, obviously the startups and the IT advantage that Israel has in this area. But also, you know, they did address some of the questions. I know, Larry, you went to the trek that had to deal with coexistence.
Yeah.
Could you tell me, because I didn't get to go on that, I was on the arts tour. What exactly happened?
Okay.
You know, if you could give us a report.
So the first thing we did is we got to listen to the architect of the separation barrier and went down to the area. First we went to Gilo, which I'd gone to in 2000 when the shooting from across the valley first happened from Beit Jala. We saw the barrier up close near Beit Lechem and around Kever Rachel. And heard a lot more about what went into the barrier, because that's a huge anti-Israel propaganda piece in the United States, especially on college campuses, and to know more about some of the stuff that they argue about, and know that they're totally full of it based on what he was telling us about some of the decisions. And then we went to I forget the name of the Husan. We went to Husan, and you know, on the thing it said, you know, meet with a Palestinian peace activist. So like, okay, so we're going to hear some the other side. Well, not quite what I was expecting, because this again isn't someone that, say, Jewish Voice for Peace would enjoy hearing. You know, he was talking about, you know, one state, two state, no state. Who cares? All we care about, 80% of Palestinians, all we care about is living in peace and dignity. And the rest of it, you know, y'all handle it. But we, you know, just let things. And that's not quite the perspective that we get back home, where it's like, you know, the settlers and the Palestinians are just at each other all the time. They never interact with each other. And, we went to Efrat, went to a couple other places, and they were talking about how, oh, yeah, we interact all the time. We're trying to interact more. The Palestinians are being pressured not to interact with us. So, that's one of the things about this conference is, for those of us outside of Israel who are writing about things in Israel and having opinions about things in Israel, it's good for us to be here every so often to get the perspective on the ground as to what people here think is important and what people here think is really happening, as opposed to what we think is happening based on what we're reading 6,000 miles away. And for me, it's also important because we're launching an additional publication. This was kind of alluded to a couple times during the programs. We're launching a publication coming out of the Southeast, and hopefully it'll go national fairly soon, Israel Insight, which is aimed at the pro-Israel Christian community. And there was a Christian media conference like this a month ago, and I know several people who were at that. And the embrace of Christian supporters of Israel who are incredibly passionate, and for the most part, it is unconditional love. And it's not with a hidden agenda. I've been covering this for 30 years in Alabama. So we're launching that magazine, and Israel's really been embracing that, especially the last few years, and the Jewish world has been waking up to it in recent years. But it's still a relatively little known phenomenon in the Jewish world.
So maybe the future of Jewish journalism is reaching out to Christians. That may be where the bottom line is.
That might
That's what we're doing.
Well, we'll see how you do. Maybe that can be a topic of an upcoming AJPA webinar, either with or without the Hartman Institute's participation, because clearly that is a very hot and somewhat delicate issue. When I was at the Jerusalem Post, even 15 years ago, that was our goal, was to get 70 million Christian Zionists reading the Jerusalem Post. And we'll see how that goes, and we'll see what that does for the art of journalism in Israel. And I want to give Ita another crack at the mic, because unfortunately, she was pointedly, I think, not invited to this conference. Among many others. And if you come to the mic and give us your sense of, you said you had a final comment, and I'm happy to hear it.
I think it's not by chance that so few Israeli journalists were invited to participate, and I wasn't there, obviously, but I would assume that there weren't a whole lot of us rank and file there.
There were a few.
A few, yeah, and a few who spoke, but
Right, mostly as speakers.
yeah. So, and you've mentioned a few, but I was thinking about the division between being an Israeli journalist and being a Jewish journalist, and I also write for media in America that is Jewish media. I'm the Israel editor for Moment magazine. And in one way, at least for me personally, they do come together. And we talk in journalism, of course, about frames and what is the frame within which we present our information as a way of organizing the information, because we can't tell an entire story about anything. It's too much. And so you frame it. And I think part of the frame that brought me here when I was 19, and certainly the frame that's kept me here, and the frame that I use as a journalist, is that Israel's an experiment. There is so much going on here that is of relevance to other countries. We are the first time in 2,000 years of Jewish sovereignty. And I don't need to make a speech of pathos here, but I really believe in that. I think that we don't quite know as a collective, based on Jewish values and Jewish heritage, what to do with power yet. I think we regularly show that we don't know what to do with power. We don't know what to do when we're in charge, how to treat the other when we're the ones who are doing the treating, meaning foreigners, refugees, asylum seekers. What is our responsibility? How do we handle this? And I think that frame, at least for me, is part of I always think of that. Part of me is always saying, how are we handling this? Because collectively, historically, it's probably the first time that we're handling it with sovereignty. And that becomes relevant not only for Jews, but for everyone. Nationalism and ethno-nationalism. Can ethno-nationalism be democratic? Interesting question, but there aren't a whole lot of countries trying to work on it.
Right.
Not post the two world wars. There certainly aren't certainly not in Europe, of a lot of countries that are not that are uni-ethnic and still trying to absorb an indigenous minority. What does that mean? How do we do that? So criticism, and I know that my columns are often considered very critical. It comes from a deep commitment, though, to believing that this experiment is worth trying. This is valid, it's unique, and it's really hard. And we mess up all the time. And messing up is okay, not okay, it's not okay. It's my job as a journalist to call on the messing up. It's my job as a journalist to call on the abuse of power. It's my job to say, what does it mean when we have a leader who's been prime minister for 10 years and is probably going to be longer, whether you like him or not? What is the intent? What happens to those kinds of things? That is what I've committed to do professionally, but it's also what I've committed to do as a Jew and a Zionist. And I think somehow that is what unites us. Even though the government press office tried to keep us not at, what they were more afraid of, I think, is us hanging out at your tables and lunch and the places where we wouldn't be controlled. And Israeli journalists are very not controllable. I would argue about the Pentagon Papers. We publish anything. What we don't publish is Israel has a Good Samaritan law, which is not common in other places. We are first responsible to human life. In fact, as a journalist, if somebody is being hurt and you have the chance to save them, you are bound to try to help them rather than to report or take a picture of it. It's a very old law, it's on the books. So we published Pentagon Papers, but I held up reporting on the when the helicopters went down a few years ago, even though we all knew it until the families were notified. There was no benefit to the public. I think the thing we cut on is benefit to the public. What did it matter to the public on a Friday night to know 2 hours earlier the two helicopters had crashed, killing 70-some young soldiers when the families didn't know yet? And so, again, that's a value that we're looking at. And I just wanted to throw that out, that perhaps we could use that to unify us in our thinking.
Yeah.
That's great. I thank you. You probably said it better than I would have. So I'm very glad to have you kind of give us that wrap up, Alan.
I think
Mike,
really,
last few
Mike, I
words?
wanted to have Mike have the last few words because I've talked enough. But you know, we've had another summit come and go, and we'll be back in another 2 years. And I hope that Mike will be able to take part in that one as well.
I surely hope. I wish I could have taken part in this one, but politics ruled the week here with everything going on. Hats off to what Jewish media is doing right now. It's so incredibly challenging. The Conference of European Rabbis was at the Knesset last week, and I spoke with the president. He's the chief rabbi of Moscow, Pinchas Goldschmidt, and we were talking about anti-Semitism. And he said, we're always asked to defend Israel. It's time that Israel starts to defend us. We need more from the government. We need more resources. We need more protection. We need them to stand up for us just as we do for them. I feel like it's the same with projects like this Jewish Media Summit. Israeli government brought y'all here because they want you to protect them. They want you to see the better side of Israel and go write about it and go talk about it and make sure it's in the public consciousness. Where's the two-way street? I think it's time for the Jewish media to say, if we're going to do this, we need more support from you. We need resources from you in order to keep us alive, in order to keep the diaspora flowing, in order to keep Jewish life vibrant. Not to fund us and be responsible for reporting back to you, but fund us because we're trying to keep Judaism alive, period. There's a balance, obviously, to be struck there, but I think it needs to be a two-way street, just as it is with the rabbis as well.
That's a great closing comment. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Alan Smason from the Crescent City Jewish News in New Orleans, who is on the American Jewish Press Association, the chair of the webinar committee, who proposed this idea to us, and all of the people who came here after a very long several days of conference and summiting to spend another hour. On behalf of myself and everybody here, I want to thank you all for watching. I believe this will also be posted online afterward as well for those of you who will, for those of the people who are on deadline and actually working
Right.
now and can't get to watch this in, it is essentially the middle of the afternoon in most of the United States. So again, thanks very much. And I'll say goodnight now from the
And-
Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem.
Happy Hanukkah.
And happy Hanukkah.